So, good afternoon, everybody. We have the pleasure today of having with us Professor Robert Elliott from University of Oregon, sorry. Robert is the interim director of both the Northwest Indian Language Institute and the Yamada Language Center at the University of Oregon. Since 1995, he has worked as a language teacher, teacher education, and online learning specialist, and has worked with language revitalization since 2008. He is a Navajo descendant. He just explained me that Dene is the name in the language, and Navajo is the name of colonial colonial language of Spanish origin. So thank you very much, and join me in welcoming Professor Robert Elliott at our research colloquium today. Thank you, and Robert, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Enrica, and thank you for having me. And I'm going to start my screen share here, and hoping I get the right one. Ta-da, I think I do. So everyone can see my screen, I hope. I see some nodding heads. Thank you for those of you that are nodding. After 2 years of pandemic, it's still a little weird getting used to presenting online purely, and getting feedback from faces is often helpful. I should say that this is the first time in about 20 years that I'm not teaching a class. So I'm doing all administration because, as Enrica said, I was asked to be interim director at two of our institutes at the university campus. So that's keeping me out of trouble and also keeping me out of the classroom. So it's nice actually to be able to come and talk to you guys and present. But I may be a little rusty on using the Zoom for class presentations, but it wasn't that long ago. So I'd like to start with just a quick land acknowledgement. That's something we often do. Where I'm presenting from at the University of Oregon is traditional Kalapuya homelands of the Kalapuyan people of the Willamette Valley. Today, their descendants live on the Grand Ronde and the Siletz reservations of Oregon. That is something that we've seen these land acknowledgements starting to become more commonly used, at least here in the United States. And I was a little curious if you guys were familiar and doing that up in Toronto. And I found on the right a land acknowledgement for Toronto that the university there is using as well. So I put that up there. You're probably familiar with it, but just wanted to acknowledge that your land has lots of different peoples that have traditionally been there, and start a little bit with that. So
thank you, Robert. We should have done that, yes, especially in this class. So my apologies, but thank you for putting that on.
I feel the way I feel about it is I don't want it to become performative, that people are just doing it. I think it should have meaning and purpose behind it, and intentionality, and not just, oh, it's something I have to do. And I don't want people ever to feel that way.
That's why that's exactly my point. And that's why thank you for this.
Yeah, no problem. So here's an outline of what I'm hoping to get through in the next 45 minutes or so. Just to give set a little bit of context, then talk a little bit about endangerment and revitalization. They don't always go hand in hand, but I might want to really get away from endangerment and look more closely at revitalization. Talking a little bit about extractive practices. I originally had 2 examples, but due to time, I think we're only going to have 1 example of creating an equitable partnership and how that, and analyzing that with by looking at spheres of influence and looking at the actors more closely. So that's what I'm hoping we can get through in the next period of time here. So let's begin a little bit with the context. But before we do, this is an article from our local newspaper, the Register Guard, from 2020. So it's about 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago. We used to have these statues on the University of Oregon campus. They were called the Pioneer Father and the Pioneer Mother, and they sat at opposite sides of the quad at the university, and kind of right in front of the administration building was the Pioneer Father. And about, there's been some controversy over what they represent and what they mean, but about 2 years ago, it was actually during a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement, and when a lot of the symbols from the South in the US were being taken down, and Confederate flags and things like that, the statues were toppled, and the Pioneer Father was laid at the steps of the Johnson Hall, which is our main administrative building. And so this is a picture of that. I think what this does is it gives a little bit of context. I think this is a symbolic of a lot of the things that I'm talking about today, this image. And some people, I don't know how I feel about, toppling down statues. I don't necessarily feel strongly that that's what should happen. And I've had this debate with lots of people in discussion and interesting, but here's the statue was from 1919. And when it was presented by the Oregon Historical Society at that time, the president said the following: the Anglo-Saxon race is a branch of the Teutonic race, and it is a liberty-loving race. It believes in the protection of life and liberty as in the rights of property and the pursuit of happiness. This race has large powers of assimilation, and its great ideas and liberty of the rights of mankind caused other races to become a part of it. So it became a people as well as a race. So, there's a lot of history of the settlers coming into Oregon. A lot of people were opposed to the idea that this statue had, as you can see in this picture, he had us carrying a bullwhip in his right hand and a rifle in his left hand. And then the history of colonization and natives in Oregon, I think, sets an interesting tone and a background for what I'm talking about. Obviously, it's not linguistics related, so it's larger. But I do want to turn now to kind of looking more about what I do and what Neely does, and give you a little bit more background there. So those of you guys are probably pretty aware of where Oregon is, over way on the left coast. It's sandwiched in between Washington and California. But I've had people who said, "Where is Oregon?" They didn't have any clue where it was. But if I say California, people always know. This is another map of the area, and what this map shows is all of the Native American, as we call them, or First Nations people, reservations and homelands in throughout the Pacific Northwest. So Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, there are quite a few reservations. The largest ones are like Warm Springs, Yakima, and Nez Perce, Colville are the ones that you can see. For size wise, but it's just to give you a sense that this is often called Indian country. So we often think of like Arizona, New Mexico, that area as Indian country because there are a lot of native folks there. But this Pacific Northwest is still also very, very much a center for native peoples. Where I work is at the Northwest Indian Language Institute, which we refer to as Neely. This is in pre-COVID days when we had a full staff going. These days we're pretty much down to a skeleton staff, and a lot of people are working remotely. But it's a little white house from the 1920s that's on the edge of campus. It's really nice because we have a lot of Native students who often feel like they're away from home. And so Neely, there's a couple other places. We have a longhouse on campus for Native students as well. But Neely can often function as a home away from home for Native students when they're at the campus. A little bit of history on Neely. It was established in 1997. This was the first summer institute that we offered, and it was originally established by people who were working on language revitalization with their tribes around Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. They had gone down to an institute in Arizona at the University of Arizona called Aldi. That's been around, I think, a little bit longer, about 30 years or so. And they had said, "This is fantastic. This is great. We need something like this in Oregon that's closer to home, so we don't have to be so far away from home. And it also specializes in our languages." So in 1997, per those requests, they came to the linguistics department at that time, because there were relationships with the linguistics department. And they said, basically, for years, you guys have making a career off of your studies, your research off of us. And in the meantime, our languages are growing smaller and smaller. They're spoken less and less. What are we getting out of this relationship? This is what we want. And so the professor at that time, who had a graduate student, Jana Underreiner, who was the first director of Neely, and she worked out of the trunk of her car and drove around and started these summer institutes. This is Neely Summer Institute from a few years ago, as it's grown through the years. We have mostly language teachers, language advocates, sometimes people that are interested in languages, but mostly these are people that are, and elders that often come. And these are people that are interested in teaching their languages and advocating for their languages back home and on the reservations. So, and we also have a youth program. A number of years ago, we noticed that most of the people attending our Summer Institute were old. They were 50 plus, and so often much older than that. And, you know, one of the things about language revitalization is we need the youth, the young people need to be speaking. And so we actually have about 10 to 12 youth that have been coming every year for about 5 or 6 years. This is, again, all pre-pandemic. The last 2 years, we've been all online. So Summer Institute is really our bread and butter, but we also do lots of projects, and that's really what I'm talking about, both out on the reservation and sometimes on campus. So that's a little bit about the context. And now I'd like to turn to talking a little bit about endangerment and revitalization. And often I'll break these up and do much longer talk about endangerment, but that's not really what we're looking at today. But I don't think you can talk about, you know, why do we have revitalization without at least a little bit of understanding the endangerment situation. And there's a lot of factors to why people are losing their languages in Oregon and in Washington and the Pacific Northwest and throughout North America and throughout the world. Really, it's a global phenomenon. But this is what we call the boarding schools. And I think you guys call them the residential schools up in Canada. This was a quote from, I think those schools were really, really efficient at doing what they wanted them to do, which was to culturally force assimilation of the native peoples. And this quote is about language by by J.D.C. Atkins, who was a commissioner of Indian Affairs, and talks about why language is so important for assimilating the native people. And so, you know, I think there's lots of other quotes I could have pulled from that era. They're all a little bit disturbing to read from our perspective in history, but I think probably you've seen some of these images as well in the past. This is Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And I think it was the first boarding school, and it definitely was the largest boarding school that was in the United States. And they passed through those doors thousands and thousands of children that were usually taken away by force, not always, but often by force. And their hair was cut. They weren't allowed to practice their religion, and they weren't allowed to speak their languages. They were in fact punished many times physically, soap washed in their mouths. They were told that their language was the devil's language, that it wasn't useful for the modern world. These were some of the before and after pictures that were sent back to Washington, D.C. to show how successful the boarding school was in civilizing the native people. And the one, I think it's Pratt was one of the generals who was in the Civil War, and he was one who started the boarding schools, and his famous slogan was "Kill the Indian, save the man," which was supposedly the progressive view at the time. It was better than, you know, completely exterminating the native population. So, there's a lot of factors to why language is endangered today, but I think that the role of the schools is irrefutable, that it had a huge effect on suppressing the languages of the people. I mentioned before that, you know, that it's a global phenomena, language endangerment, and in fact, the Living Tongues Institute has a graphic that I've always liked to pull up, and showing how the 5 hot spots, as they call them, that have the highest level of language endangerment around the globe. And 2 of them are in North America, Oklahoma in the Southwest, and then us in the Pacific Northwest. So we've a lot of it is highly threatened right now. So that, like I was saying, the boarding school legacy and the cultural assimilation has had a lot of effects. Some people have broken those effects down into individuals, families, tribal communities, and tribal nations. I think when we look at the one that's on loss of language has a lot of effects in those other areas. So your loss of identity, low self-esteem in the individual area, I think a lot of that is affected by loss of language. Weakened nation structure, depleted numbers of enrollment. I think language also has something to do with that. Loss of sense of community, traditions and ceremonies. Obviously, language is highly involved in all of those areas. So, the boarding school legacy has been quite devastating on Native communities, particularly on Native youth, who we just talked a little bit about. Here are some facts that can be talked about with Native youth being highly at risk. And these are some statistics that are pretty devastating. More than 1 out of 3 American Indian and Alaska Native children live in poverty. 67% of them graduate, only 67% graduate from high school. So that's the lowest rate of any ethnic or racial group in the US. And then suicide rate is something I've seen quite a bit in working with Native communities out on the reservations. It can be really devastating to see how a suicide of a young person just ripples through a community and has these incredibly negative effects throughout the whole cohort of young people there, and they're 2.5 times higher than the rate for non-Native students in the 15 to 24 age group. So the kids are being affected by this. I guess a lot of times I've heard it as feeling unmoored. They don't know who they are, how they fit in. They don't get that their history and their background is not clear a lot of times. But one of the things we've heard from our elders for many, many years is that Native language and learning is within a rich cultural context is a protective factor for kids that are at risk, that it supports wellness and academic achievement. And it's interesting, these are 2 elders that we've worked closely with, Lavina Wilkins and Virginia Beavert. Virginia Beavert, who's in the middle shot there, she actually lives next door to the Neely house on campus. We have an extra house that's right next door, the smaller one. And she's been there since about 12 or 13 years. She came to the University of Oregon to get her PhD, and she is the oldest graduate at the age of 90 with her PhD in linguistics. For a lot of the work she's been doing actually started when she was young. She worked with some of the linguists traveling through the Pacific Northwest and helped them originally with documentation of the languages. In the 50s and 60s, she started documenting the language herself, collecting stories and recording elders, because she saw that people were speaking the language less and less. And then by the time it was the 1990s, and then she was teaching the language in the 70s and 80s. And in the 1990s, she came back to the university and was able to get her PhD. So she does. She was one of the original founders of Neely as well. When I mentioned that tribal elders had come, tribal people had come and asked for an institute like the one down in Arizona, and so she was one of those people as well. But they've been telling us for a long, long time that language is an important protective factor. But what's kind of interesting is that this is maybe the Native knowledge and the Native insight that people have had, but it isn't really until now we're starting to get some articles. There's a couple of research articles that have been published, and I think these are actually out of Canada, that are talking about how identity and language actually shore up Native youth. So there are more and more connections being drawn to this in a Western sort of way that look at language, the connection between well-being and language. So I think it's, you know, elders have known this for a long time. It's part of Native knowledge, but it isn't really recognized. And this is a theme that we'll come back to a little bit later. It's not necessarily recognized until it's done in a Western sort of a Western way. So I do want to talk not just about the endangerment, but about language revitalization, because sometimes that gets left out. So even though a lot of languages are very, very highly endangered, or sometimes there's no L1 speakers, first language speakers that are left. But originally there was incredible linguistic diversity in what is now the state of Oregon. In fact, there were approximately, there's some debate over, you know, what's a language and what's a dialect, but 25 to 28 languages and 13 different language families are often considered how many, what kind of linguistic diversity was represented in Oregon. And so that's huge, but you know, even today, there's not a number of them are not being revitalized, but still, if this list on the left here is kind of, and they're color coded to some of the areas in the language families, but this gives you an idea of some of the languages that are being revitalized in the state of Oregon and the Pacific Northwest today. So, you know, there's quite a few languages that are listed on there. And so often that's forgotten about, that all these languages are being actively taught, being actively learned. Sometimes they're called new speakers, that we're developing new speakers of the language. And but you know, it's not, they're not necessarily, there's a few people that are even raising their children. They're taking a very strong stand and raising their children in an indigenous language. So it's really quite an interesting phenomena. And it's been growing probably since the 1980s and 90s when it started in Oregon. In Hawaii, where a lot of inspiration was taken from to start a lot of these language revitalization, that started really in the 70s with Hawaiian Renaissance era. There was a cultural and linguistic renaissance, and Hawaii is still looked at as a model by many Native communities to see what they do. They have, in fact, if you ever go to the Big Island of Hawaii, they have preschool. I've had the chance to visit one of their schools, their language schools that they have there, and they have preschools where children, you know, daycare centers where there's 3-month-old, 6-month-old that are being taken care of there, and they're spoken to in Hawaiian. They're caretakers. I remember when they were talking with us when we did a group that came through, and they would cover the ears of the children so that they wouldn't hear the English, and then, you know, only hear that speak the Hawaiian to them. But you can go from that age through K through 12 and through college at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. And now they even have a PhD that you can get in the Hawaiian language. You can write your dissertation in Hawaiian. So, but you know, Hawaii is a very different situation. They're an island. It's one single language. And so it's quite a different phenomena when you're looking at Hawaii. And their numbers are quite a lot bigger. Here's the 9 federally recognized tribes of Oregon. This is not fully vetted. This is some early work that we've done with some of the languages. But just to give you an idea of the numbers we're talking about, these are the number of people on the reservation that just live on the reservation. So if we're looking at 4,800, 5,200 people on the reservation, only a small subset of that are interested in language, and many of the tribes have no first language speakers left, in the sense that they were people that were actually raised with the language. So they're working a lot. Some of these situations, they're working purely from documentation, what was written down, what was recorded, what was captured earlier. So numbers are small. And so the situation in Oregon is quite different than it is in, say, Hawaii, or the other place people sometimes look at is New Zealand with the Maori and their language revitalization programs and how they've done. But again, the situation's quite different on the mainland than it is in some of these Hawaiian communities. Here's another map that I made a few years ago that looks at all of the different languages, maybe not all of them, but the different languages that we have partnered with at Neely through the years. And so these are all different languages that have some type of working on some kind of language revitalization. Sometimes these are, sponsored officially through the tribe, where there's schools or in the local high school. Sometimes they'll have that. Sometimes they're just independent groups or organizations that are working on their own to try to shore up or document or teach the language to other people. So, but it does, sometimes it's forgotten. And my point really is that, yes, languages are endangered, but there is a lot of effort, a lot of work, a lot of people, not big numbers, but there is a lot of linguistic diversity. And these are very important for these populations, for their identity, for their well-being, for as a protective factor for their youth, et cetera. So one thing I do like to mention, if you've been a language teacher or thought about that before, language revitalization is really fundamentally different than other types of language teaching. And there's probably a number of reasons why, but these are three that I think are some of the most important ones. First of all, there's this phenomenon called the teacher learner. So let's say you're on a tribe, maybe you've got, if you're lucky, you've got a couple of elders who speak the language in their 80s or maybe in their 90s. But maybe you've had some interaction and you're learning the language, but maybe you're the person who's the best, but you were not raised with the language. It's your second language. And so this is the phenomena of the teacher learner. You're not necessarily fluent, which we would call, in an actful scale or some other kind of scale. You're not advanced or superior. Maybe you're intermediate, or maybe, if you're lucky, you're advanced in the language, and you're expected to be teaching the language to people. So a lot of times what you hear about is this staying one step ahead of your students, like having to talk to your elders, having to look through the material, know how to use the material, the resources that are there, the archives, to find out what you need for tomorrow's lesson. So and there's so few materials, you're literally writing the book as you go. So that teacher learner phenomena is really different than most other languages, even what we call lictals, less commonly taught languages in the States, at least we call them that. So like Thai or Urdu is another language we have at University of Oregon. They don't have a lot of materials, but at least they have some materials. And so many of these languages have practically nothing. The other thing I think about is when I was in college, I did a study abroad year in Sweden and came back home. And my Swedish is pretty good and then really gets bad after a while. But what I can always go back to Sweden, and I get told when I've gone back on occasions, I'm totally immersed in the language. I hear it everywhere, on the train, on the radio, on the TV, the announcements. It's just everywhere, right? So there's this homeland for Sweden or the Swedish language that I can always go to, or someone who's a Swedish heritage person can always go to that country and totally get immersed in it. The language is doing fine, it's there. But for Native folks, these are their homelands. So the English is predominant on the reservation, and the ones that are working on their language, on language revitalization, there's very few, and there's just not a lot of opportunities. It's up to them really to take this forward to the next generation. And that's so different than other language situations. And of course, the last thing is this forced versus voluntary assimilation that we've seen. I think, at least for immigrant groups coming into North America, there's an element of, okay, I want to learn English because I want to get ahead. I want to get a job, things like that. And obviously the history of the boarding schools and the forced assimilation that many Native folks had to go through is quite different. And so in a way, it reminds me of, what's happening in the Ukraine, or what's happened in the past with this. I was reading some interesting articles about how Russia really wanted to change the Ukrainian alphabet to make it more like Russian. Some of the ideas behind, when people are switching from Russian to Ukrainian, and how CCCP had tried to, really force Russification and the language on other countries as part of that assimilation process. So I can imagine, like, say, Ukraine in 100 years, if they were really forced to give up their language, what that would be like. but even still, that doesn't quite match, because the Ukrainian language and Russian and the cultures are much more similar than the clash that we would have seen between native groups and the Western colonizers that were moving out. So there's parallels, but even that's not completely the same. So I'd like to now talk a little bit about the extractive, the kind of a little bit of the history of linguistics. I think anthropology and other disciplines have fallen into this area of what's sometimes called extractive practices. So I'm going to start with a picture of, this is J.P. Harrington, who was a famous linguist who worked within the Pacific Northwest in the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. I think he worked all the way through the 1930s. It's kind of a love-hate relationship, because his work is so valuable in some ways, the work that he did, because it is documentation, and he did come through and get voices and written down transcripts of many of the native people that he encountered in that era. But at the same time, the way that he worked is often considered very colonial or very extractive in its methodology. And this is Harrington again on the right. He was using all the latest technology of his time. That recording equipment in that last picture, I think, is kind of laughable. It's fun to look at that compared to what we have now. But he also had a Model T or whatever this is, and was able to drive around California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho at that era, and go out and get informants and go out and document the language. So a lot of the linguists, I'm not mean to pick on him, because this was the methodology a lot of the linguists had at that time, and anthropologists as well, that it was an object of study. Knowledge was a commodity that they could go out and mine, and it was up to them to go and harvest it before it was lost forever, because the idea at that time was all the native people, all the native cultures are going to be gone within the next 30, 40, 50 years. They really thought they would be extinct and it would be gone forever. But this knowledge of domination, and one of the articles that I sent to you, the one that's Beyond Development one, talks a little bit about this, how the logic of domination informed a lot of the work that happened at that time in that method. It was the idea that European forms of knowledge were spread, and those were the ones that were valid. Those are the ones that were useful. Indigenous knowledge was considered useless, and it was suppressed. It wasn't important. And again, I would think back to that earlier image I had of our elders saying, "Hey, we've known for years that language is a protective factor." That's indigenous knowledge that they've had and they've known, but it isn't until it's been validated by research in Western universities that it's then, okay, oh yeah, what do you know? We just discovered this. But elders have known this for a long time, that you strip away the language, it's going to really harm the people. And the other element of this is native informants had to be trained, and they were really not treated that well. You can hear some of the old recordings, and they're the kind of the dynamic, the relationship between the Western researcher and the informant who's being researched upon is pretty appalling. And I don't think many people would take that kind of a route today, but it's still it was a part of the framework of thinking at that time. And then thinking about language as an object that's divorced from the community who speaks it. So really just analyzing language and not thinking about its social uses, that this is a community that needs this language for their ceremonies, for their spirituality, for raising their children. So what that resulted in is these PhD thesis or documentation work that now, when we turn to it as people that are trying to help communities restore their language, they're not very useful, right? So I can see minimal pairs and that they're eliciting because they're trying to see what are the sound system of the language, right? But how do you say good morning, how are you? Fine, thanks, how are you? That's not there, you know? So it's like nothing that would be useful, or I wouldn't say nothing. It's very difficult to now, as a person who knows about pedagogy and teaching and language and what people need for every daily communication, to go back and look at the work that was done in the 1900s. It's largely hard. It's very hard to use it for any kind of language instruction and for daily use. So another thing I have is, like, I've got several times I've been approached by people who have these great ideas about, oh, so you work with native languages. Well, I've got this great idea. I've got this, company that we can put it online and we can get it, and we could probably charge people $2,000. They could take the course, blah, blah, blah. So I've encountered a number of people that they still have that mentality that the language is just there, that anybody can take it, that it can be packaged and then sold, and not even a member of the community. So that type of thinking, is I think when we think of larger languages, like, say, French or Spanish, it doesn't necessarily belong to any one person or community. It's just kind of different. So it's like, oh, here's how you say this in Spanish, or here's how you do this. But for these communities, there's a sense of ownership over the languages that doesn't exist. And it's hard to explain if people have a more, a very much of a knowledge as a commodity mindset. It just changes the way that you look at language. And Native peoples typically don't. This next part is looking a little bit about evolving paradigms. And so I think this kind of shows nicely, this is from the Grunwald article, and it really shows nicely how the way we think about language work has evolved. And by the on, for, with, and by prepositions. So originally, that early extractive linguistics, extractive anthropology, you were doing work on a language. And that's really giving you that idea that language is a commodity. It's just this thing that exists outside of a community. I think in the 1960s, 1970s, there was a lot of shift, and people had a lot of awakening sympathies for Native cultures and Native people in the United States, in North America. And so people wanted to work for a language or for a people. And in a sense, this is a little bit of what resulted from that, is a little bit of this white savior mentality, that I'm going to go in and I'm going to save these people as an outsider. Probably the more current paradigm that we see is with a community. And that's what I think is still relatively new to a lot of folks that are working in academia, where you actually partner with them and you let the Native community or the community you're working with drive the research and drive the conversation, and at least on an equal, if not even more strong than just equal relationship. So the way you have to balance that out through commitment and long-term involvement and other things. But the last one, I think, is where I think we're starting to go at Neely, and where I think a lot of people would eventually to go, and that's where language work is done by the community. So in this case, you would be training capacity with the tribe, the group that you're working with, so that they can become the linguists, so they can become the documenters, so they can become the teachers. And it doesn't have to be even with, you can totally pull yourself out of that equation. And they're on their own. So that's, I think, ultimately where that would be the place to go. There's this other DDAR, which Grunwald brings up as well. And that's just this idea of a lot of times, if you have speakers in a language, you have to start with description. You don't have to, but it's a good idea to start with description and documentation. That you need to, as long as you have those speakers, get as much from them as you can that you can save for posterity. Ideally, you're doing it in a more egalitarian way and not in an extractive way, but definitely that still needs to be done. There's a place for documentation and description, just in a more evolved way. And then after you have the language, or maybe in some cases, when some of our language groups lose their last speaker, you can move to archiving those documentations And revitalization is the final step where you start actually teaching and figuring out how to use those materials that are archived. The archiving process is really important though, because you need to do that in order to be organized and be able to find things. This last example I have is one of the conferences we have in our field is called CoLang, I guess the idea of cooperative language or something like coexisting language. So we're together, working together. But when I first started in doing this work in 2008, 2010, it was actually called Infield, and they changed their name, I think, in 2014 to CoLang. And that the whole idea behind that is to change the way that it's no longer like the infield seems like you're going out in the field, you're observing someone. It's again kind of that old extractive linguistic way of looking at things. And so they thought CoLang is working together in partnerships. It signals that a little bit more like with a community rather than on a community. So I think that the field has evolved quite a bit. I've seen a lot of change even in the 12, 14 years I've been working in it. And I think it's making a difference with the communities. So we're going pretty, it's 2:45 almost. So I'm gonna try to get through this, probably the part that's more research oriented, where, and by talking about one example of an equitable partnership, and then how we analyze that at Neely for spheres of influence and analysis of the actors. So there's this language called Ichiskien, which is one of the largest languages in our area. It's part of the Sahaptin family. If you look at this particular map here, Ichiskien is spoken in Yakima, Umatilla, and Warm Springs reservations. And then Nez Perce is kind of a sister or a cousin language, which is spoken just off to the side. The dark spots that you see are the current reservation locations, and the larger colored area is the traditional homelands that each of these groups originally used to have. But Ichiskien is spoken in 1, 2, 3, those 3 reservations there. And in the Pacific Northwest, it's the most commonly spoken language. This is one of my favorite maps because it talks about most commonly spoken Native American language by state. And you can see that Navajo is very large and very spread throughout the South. And probably that's because they're a very large group is one of the reasons. But up in Washington and in Oregon, Sahaptin is Ichiskien. It's also known as Ichiskien. Sahaptin is the colonial name for it, and Ichiskien is the more local name. And that's the #1 language that's spoken in our area. So we actually teach Sahaptin, Ichiskien at the University of Oregon. It's one of 2 indigenous languages that are taught there here. So this project called Wangamu Project was originally envisioned as a linguistics seminar. And basically, there's a seminar that happens every year for both undergraduate, advanced undergraduates, and then graduate students. That's why it's a 400, 500 level course. And the idea was to gain a community perspective. And this was originally offered in the winter of 2015 with 15 students. And some of them were Native and some of them were non-Native. And the idea behind it, again, this is Virginia Beavert, who is the Yakima Ichiskien speaking elder who graduated at age 90. She still is with us. She turned 100 this past year, and she's still working on her language, teaching the language at the school. But this was part of her idea, was to train University of Oregon students, linguistics students, in linguistics, curriculum development, and language documentation. But what was really compelling and different about this was the projects would go back to the communities. They would experience documenting, creating teaching materials, and contribute to the corpus of Ichiskien text, which again, there's not that much that's there in these languages. And there would be multiple ways of avenues to have like this free flow of teachers from the reservation, learners from the reservation, coming to university, and people from the university going out there. So let's look a little bit more at how this did. These are some of the things that we were trying to do, addressing the requests for elders to document traditional foods by creating teaching materials. And this is documented around Wangamu, which is also called camas. It's camas, and it's a traditional root that is harvested by many of the native peoples of the Pacific Northwest. To understand this life cycle, gathering, preparation, its use, to develop lessons and materials with input from the tribal teachers, and to pilot this on the reservation as well as at our summer institute, and then to bring back those materials to the people that are using them. So here's some examples of what the students were able to create. Identification, the life cycle, gathering, preparation, preservation. So students were able to use different skills. That the student was, for example, a really good artist, and so she ended up drawing a lot of the artwork that's in here. Other students were good with technology, with recording teachers, things like that. Here are some of the lesson plans and this the course syllabi that was created through this. These are more of the cards that were created for vocabulary. And this is a closer look at those. And for example, looking at specific parts of the plant in the language. So a lot of times this is not necessarily language that you would have a lot of insight into. You really need an elder who is really familiar with the language in order to get at a lot of this deeper language of talking about the roots and what's there and what to look at. Again, this is more about vocabulary. With some complex sentences that are being written, like the woman is pressing out liquid in the camas for baking in the ground. So talking about the vocabulary and also how that strings together into the grammatical construction in the language. So a lot of materials that were developed that, we didn't know if they were going to work or not. And so we were able to pilot them in the Summer Institute. But this is something else, because in a lot of Native communities, you don't want to just go out and harvest or do things. You want to do it in a good way with a prayer or a thank you for harvesting the materials. So this was from Virginia. Her Indian name is Tecumseh. And so she did this little introduction for her students so that they would know about the culture and how to harvest the materials. So for example, maybe you want a lesson on this kind of root. I know that these days men dig and you all will dig with good hearts. So this was something that came up because traditionally digging was a woman's job and only the women would do it. But today gender roles are more fluid, even on what people are able to do. Now you will first go to it and you will request of the camas, the creator puts you this good food here on his land, and I will take you as a medicine for my body, and I will be grateful to you when you give yourself for my life. This is how you will handle it when you first dig it up with a root digger. So Virginia added this message into the materials that were documented. She thought that was really important, that you have to have a good heart before you go and you harvest and you take the things. You have to do it in the right cultural tradition way. So materials were provided. There were lots of examples. We were building trust between academic institutions and involving multiple elders. But I'm going to go to this last part because I think this is when we started to analyze what actually had happened during this project of this class that occurred, and some of the aftermath that also led to further relations there. This is a graphic that comes from Greenwald and Sinha, and I think it was also in the reading that I suggested. She's done this, used this a couple of times. One of the things that Greenwald talks a little bit about, when I've had the chance to speak with her quite a bit, we've worked on some things together. She talks about how academia is this ivory tower that's often just dislocated from the communities that it's working with, and there's no connection there. Even within that ivory tower, you can talk about theoretical work being more valued than applied work. And in linguistics, we find that with theoretical linguists who tend to look at their work as the pure, impartial, more scientific work, and applied linguists or field linguists who do field documentation, that's more grunge work that anybody can do. And some examples I've had is when I've been talking with people about the work that I do, I've had people say things, oh, that's not really linguistics, that's social work. Or I've actually, and even one time, even more derogatory I felt was, well, that's social engineering. You're getting involved with, communities. You're not just studying what's happening, which I find kind of, much more of a extractive colonial way of looking at things. So we took Colette's, Grinvald's idea and worked with her actually in creating this about how Neely works. And Neely is that's the little bridge that's right here that connects the university to the local teaching of the languages. And so we really look at it as like a two-way bridge that, you know, things flow back and forth between the university and the local communities. And then these other spheres are like Oregon and the tribal community, the federal community, all things that are happening. But really what the work that Neely does is connecting the university, particularly people that are working on language revitalization, to people that are working on language revitalization within the communities. So in that project that we were looking at, the Camas project, the Wakuma project, these are some of the people that were involved with it from, you know, and I'll give you, this is just to get a visual of some of them who are. In fact, this person right here is Jana Underreiner, who was I told you about the graduate student who worked out of the trunk of her car at Neely when she was first founded. And she's our former director who's she's just stepped down last summer. And so I've taken over, but she's the one who was instrumental in getting that class going. And I was working as the documenter, training students on how to use cameras. So some of the actors that were involved, we had at the university, we had professors, students, elders, videographer trainer, language instructor, students, deans, professors, so lots of different people. At Summer Institute, when we piloted the class there, we had Ichiskien elders from several different tribes, 15 students, tribal members, and 2 UO student volunteers that were also working there. And then later at the tribe, when we were able to share the materials with the tribal community, there were, again, Ichiskien language teachers and elders, 50 high school students and 15 university students that were all involved in benefiting from the materials after they had been vetted at the Summer Institute and created originally through that course. So if we're looking at that, back at that graphic, we can see on the left the different actors that were from the university. At Summer Institute, that bridge between the university and the communities, that's where that other set worked. And then at when the materials went back to the tribe, these were the tribal community members that were then able to use those materials. So the last thing I want to look at here is the actors' comments and some of the feedback we collected from that. So this is a university dean. Offering Ichiskien gives our students another option for language study and contributes to the UO's diverse, demanding, and high quality curriculum, and makes us a strong research one institution. So, you know, that's where they're thinking we have to show that we're committed to diversity, and we have to show we're a strong research university. So it pleased him, which we were happy for. Tribal leader. It's an intellectual project of participating Ichiskien language documentation and revitalization, serves as a scholarly contribution as well as social justice practice towards building a more moral community. So tribal leaders were pretty happy with the way this project unfolded. University instructor. Today, these communities are our partners in research, are regaining some trust in the mainstream educational system, and enhance our collective research. The tribal high school teacher. This was the first time I had been introduced to linguistics as an educational discipline. As a bonus, during my initial Neely session, linguistic terms and examples were provided to me in Ichiskien. It was at this time I saw linguistics as a way of helping me better understand, teach, and more quickly learn Ichiskien. I saw linguistics as a tool to help unlock the code that holds languages together. Graduate student quote, my connections with the tribes and the university have been strengthened. I worked with the tribal elders. So this was a native graduate student. And then a tribal high school student. It has also inspired me to work with my indigenous language, help to get to know the welcoming community here at the university. So, you know, we're hoping that we have had a number of students that we've worked with that have come to the UO as undergraduates, gone on to graduate degrees sometimes, and have some that are now back teaching languages back at their tribes. The partnerships that were involved, we had the elder, we had the seminar, teachers from the original, from the tribe communities. We had the Ichiskien class, and then 2 schools, the Wapato High School and the college that's on the reservation. the summer institute class back at the university, and then the tribal units. So this really fostered a lot of the relationships. It built stronger connections between all the people that partnered in making this class and this project happen. The last thing I would say is that Neely has what we call a digital archive or a resource center. And the materials are housed in that resource center and available to be disseminated more widely. So, it's something that's given back to the community and not something that just stays in an academic ivory tower collecting dust on a shelf somewhere. This is a screenshot from our resource center. So just to wrap up, there's a lot of benefits of this work, of truly collaborative work for the tribe, building capacity of the schools. It's multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary. It's based on participation with the communities, collaborative space for all the people. I often thing focused on how the tribes are benefiting from the work the universities do, but I think the universities are benefiting just as much, if not more. It helps indigenize the academy. It provides a pipeline. I'm going to say something about that in a second, for Native students to attend higher education institutions. And I don't know, it just does a lot of things. I think it helps. We have an MOUs that it helps to make sure that we follow through on some of those commitments, and makes materials available for our resource bank and makes us able to have a purpose for being. So the pipeline metaphor I hear used quite a bit. Neely is a pipeline for Native students to come to the university, so they're going to feel more comfortable. And pipelines and Native folks it doesn't jive real well a lot of times, for obvious reasons. But one of the things we came up with a few years ago was this metaphor that it's not really a pipeline, but it's more like a river. And the top of the river, the headlands where the tribal communities are, and we have elders and people that are working on language revitalization. And as you come down the river, you can get more to the high schools and the Neely Summer Institute. And then you get further down the river, you're at the university working with the MA students and the student workers that come to Neely. But it's a free flow, and there's a transportation of stuff that moves back and forth. It's not a one-way street with a pipeline. It's really much more of a organic view or metaphor to use with that. So I don't know. I feel like I'm repeating myself. There's a lot of these reasons why I think this type of work is equitable and collaborative and makes a difference in the way that you work with communities, whether that be Native communities or other people that you're working with. I think this truly equitable or truly collaborative projects are something that's desperately needed by academics and academia, not this extractive view or colonial view of things. And sometimes I think of this idea of let's decolonize the university, and sometimes I think that's rather abstract. But when I was looking at this was just off of a website. I just thought that some of the work that we're doing at Neely really is concrete, and it's very much focused in a methodology that's very different than the type of work that was done in the 20th century, particularly in the early 20th century. And anyway, so that decolonizing, I think, is kind of a buzzword, but I also think that there's important things to take away from it. So with that, I want to say Kwafla Nushamatash, or Hayumasi, or Shushanila, which are some of the different languages that we work with. How do you say thank you in those languages? There's references and a final slide there. So I think I went a little bit longer than expected, but thank you for being patient, and I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts or comments that you might have.
Well, so thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much, Robert, for this very inspiring and complete and clear presentation. I think you gave us really a lot to think about and to discover also, because it's not the same area where we are. And thank you also for all this time that you gave us. Good. Now I stop our recording, and I let you ask questions, provide comments, discuss with our presenter.